At 57, Margaret Hale stood on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases, the clothes she could carry, and exactly 100 left after her own children told her she was no longer welcome in the family home. She had spent her entire life raising them, helping pay their bills, and putting everyone else's future ahead of her own. Now, with nowhere to go, she made a decision that everyone in town called foolish. She spent her last $100 buying an abandoned walnut farm that people said wasn't worth the land it stood on. The walnut trees were dying, the farmhouse was falling apart, and the old storage barn looked ready to collapse with the next storm. The auctioneer shook his head. The neighbors laughed. Even the man handing her the deed quietly said, "You'll be back trying to sell it before winter." But only a few weeks later, while clearing broken stone from the floor of the old walnut storage barn, Margaret noticed a hollow sound beneath her feet. As she brushed away decades of dirt, she uncovered the outline of a sealed stone door that appeared on no modern blueprint. Hidden beneath the forgotten farm was something that had remained untouched for generations. And what waited inside would completely change the story of the family who once owned that land. But before we open that hidden stone door together, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. If you're starting your morning, I hope today brings you peace, good health, and something to smile about. If you're enjoying stories about forgotten farms, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people finding extraordinary second chances, please leave a comment. Let me know you're here. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next journey. Margaret Hale was holding the blue ceramic bowl she had dried 1,000 times when her oldest son told her she needed to leave. The kitchen had once been hers, warm with Sunday dinners, birthday cakes, and a marriage that had lasted 34 years. Now every cupboard had been relabeled, every chair shifted, every decision made without her. "We need the space," Daniel said, keeping his eyes on the papers across the table. His younger brother. Paul stood near the refrigerator with his arms folded. Their father had been dead 11 months. Since then, the house had been sold to cover debts Margaret had never known existed, and the small rental the boys arranged was now too expensive. Daniel slid a train schedule toward her. "Aunt Clara said you can stay a few weeks." Margaret looked from one son to the other. "A few weeks?" Neither answered. She set the bowl down because her hands had begun to shake. "By sunset." Everything she owned fit into 2 suitcases and a canvas handbag. Daniel gave her $50 for the ticket, but Margaret used part of it to pay an overdue pharmacy charge before leaving town. When she counted the money remaining in the station restroom, she had exactly $100. It was not enough for a new life, barely enough for a room. But she folded the bills into her wallet. She spent the night in a bus depot after learning Aunt Clara had gone to stay with her daughter in another state. At dawn, Margaret saw a notice pinned beside the vending machines. "County property auction, abandoned agricultural parcels." She read it because one listing had been circled in red pencil. Whitmore Walnut Farm, minimum bid $100. The auction was held that afternoon in a drafty municipal hall. The Walnut Farm drew laughter before the clerk finished describing it. 42 acres, neglected orchard, uninhabitable farmhouse, collapsing nut storage barn, unpaid taxes forgiven under county reclamation terms. A man behind Margaret whispered that the trees had not produced a proper crop in 20 years. Another said the roof leaked worse than the sky. When the clerk asked for an opening bid, no hand rose. Margaret thought of the bus depot, Daniel's train schedule, and Aunt Clara's empty house. Then she lifted her hand. $100. Someone snorted. The clerk stared at her. "Ma'am, you understand the property is sold as is. I understand." No one bid against her. The gavel struck once, and the room filled with soft laughter. Margaret signed the deed with a borrowed pen and walked outside with no money left. The farm stood 6 miles beyond town, at the end of a road narrowed by weeds and walnut branches. The farmhouse leaned east, its porch gray and splintered, its windows filmed with dust. Rows of walnut trees stretched behind it, many bare, some twisted, a few still holding late leaves that clicked in the wind. Margaret unlocked the front door with the county key and found 2 rooms dry enough to use, 1 iron stove, and a mattress frame without a mattress. She sat on the floorboards as evening gathered and felt the weight of what she had done. She had exchanged her last $100 for a broken house and dying trees. A truck arrived before dark. The woman who climbed out introduced herself as Eleanor Briggs, owner of the seed store in town. She carried bread, preserves, and a wool blanket. "I heard who bought the Whitmore place," Eleanor said. "Most people expected the county to bulldoze it." Margaret accepted the blanket. "Did you know the owner, Samuel Whitmore?" Everyone knew of him. Eleanor looked toward the orchard. "He lived alone at the end." "Was he always alone?" "No. But stories get smaller when the people who remember them die." She paused. "There are farms built to make money, Mrs. Hale, and there are farms built to keep people standing." Before Margaret could ask what she meant, another truck entered the yard. Ethan Brooks, the neighboring walnut grower, had come to inspect the roof before rain. After climbing through the attic with a lantern, he returned covered in dust. "The west side can be patched," he said. "The east beam needs bracing before winter." "I can't pay you." "I didn't ask." Together they moved buckets beneath leaks and covered a broken window with canvas. As Ethan prepared to leave, Margaret asked about the long stone building behind the orchard. "Old nut storage barn," he said. "Floors uneven. Don't move anything heavy alone." The warning led her there the next morning. Dust covered the sorting tables, and walnut shells crunched beneath her shoes. Along the back wall, she found a rusted cabinet filled with receipts, seed catalogs, and rolled plans. One plan showed the farmhouse, orchard rows, barn, and livestock sheds as they existed decades earlier. Margaret flattened it across a table. Beneath the storage barn, a narrow rectangular space had been drawn below ground level. She carried the plan outside and compared it with the county blueprint attached to her deed. On the modern copy, the underground space did not exist. Margaret folded the 2 blueprints together and carried them back into the farmhouse. She spread them across the kitchen table beside the deed, studying every line until afternoon light drifted across the faded paper. The modern county drawing showed only a solid foundation beneath the nut storage barn. The older plan clearly marked a narrow rectangular chamber below the stone floor. Someone had erased an entire section of the property from official records. She wanted to dismiss it as an old construction change, but the difference stayed with her long after she lit the iron stove for the evening. The next morning she began with the work she understood. Broken shutters came down first. Loose branches were gathered into piles. Fallen walnuts were cleared from the front walk. Every task reminded her how much the farm had been neglected. Several orchard rows had disappeared beneath weeds taller than her waist. The remaining walnut trees leaned at uneven angles, their bark scarred by years without pruning. Margaret paused beneath one of the oldest trees and rested her hand against its trunk. It still felt alive. The farm did not seem abandoned as much as forgotten. Shortly before noon, a polished pickup truck rolled slowly into the yard. The driver stepped out wearing pressed jeans, clean boots, and a crisp work jacket that looked untouched by dirt. He introduced himself as Victor Kane, owner of Kane Agricultural Holdings. His smile never quite reached his eyes. "Mrs. Hale," he said, looking over the orchard, "I heard someone actually bought this place." "I did." "Then let me save you a great deal of trouble." He removed a folded document from a leather folder. I'm prepared to buy the property today, cash. You'll make a comfortable profit on your investment." Margaret glanced at the figure. It was several times what she had paid only days earlier. Under different circumstances, she might have accepted without hesitation. "You've driven a long way for land everyone says is worthless," she said. Victor laughed softly. "Worthless land is often the easiest to manage. I already own farms on both sides. This would simplify operations." Margaret folded the offer and handed it back. "I haven't had time to understand what I bought. Understanding it won't improve the roof." His eyes moved briefly toward the old storage barn before returning to her. "Think it over. These buildings become expensive very quickly." After he left, the silence around the orchard seemed heavier. Margaret watched the truck disappear through the walnut trees, wondering why a successful businessman wanted a neglected farm before she had even unpacked her second suitcase. Late that afternoon, Ethan Brooks arrived carrying lumber across the bed of his truck. "Heard Victor stopped by," he said while unloading boards near the porch. Margaret looked surprised. "News travels quickly." Ethan smiled. "In a town this small, it usually gets there before the people do." Together, they replaced 2 damaged porch supports. Ethan worked carefully, explaining which beams could wait until spring and which needed immediate attention. Margaret appreciated that he never treated her like someone incapable of learning. When they paused for water, she asked about Samuel Whitmore. Ethan rested against the railing. "Most folks remember the ending. They forget everything before it." Eleanor said something similar. "Samuel used to grow the healthiest walnuts around here. Then things changed. Crops failed, bills piled up. People said he refused offers that would have saved the farm." "Did anyone know why?" Ethan shrugged. "Not really. Some called him stubborn. Others said he was protecting something. Nobody ever agreed on what." Before leaving, Ethan walked through the storage barn with Margaret. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the roof, falling across old grading tables and rusted equipment. Along one wall stood shelves filled with cracked jars, broken baskets, and dust-covered tools. Margaret opened drawer after drawer until she found a small cloth pouch tucked beneath a warped wooden tray. Inside rested an unusual key carved from smooth gray stone rather than metal. It was cool despite the warm afternoon. One end had been shaped into a narrow shaft with carefully cut grooves unlike any ordinary house key. Ethan turned it over in his hand. "Never seen anything like this." Margaret slipped it into her apron pocket. "Maybe it belonged to Samuel." "Maybe." His eyes wandered slowly around the barn. "Or maybe it opened something no one remembers anymore." The following morning, Margaret visited Eleanor's seed store for nails and lamp oil. When she showed the older woman the stone key, Eleanor frowned thoughtfully. "I haven't seen one of these since I was a little girl. Do you know what it opens?" "No. But Samuel always carried strange things in his pockets, seeds, bits of stone, little notebooks." Eleanor disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a weathered photograph inside a cracked frame. It showed the walnut farm decades earlier during harvest season. Workers stood smiling outside the storage barn. Wagons loaded with sacks waited beneath healthy walnut trees. Margaret studied the building carefully. Something immediately felt different. A wide stone stairway descended beside the barn entrance, leading below ground. She looked up. "That stairway isn't there now." Eleanor nodded. "It disappeared long before the farm was abandoned." Margaret borrowed the photograph and returned home before sunset. She compared the old image with the present barn. The staircase had been replaced by a continuous stone floor extending from one wall to the other. There was no sign that steps had ever existed. After sweeping years of dust from the center of the barn, She knelt with the photograph beside her, measuring by the support posts. She located where the old stairway should have begun. She picked up a small hammer from the workbench and struck one of the flat stones. The sound rang sharp and solid. She moved several inches and struck again. Still solid. Then she tapped a third stone near the exact spot shown in the photograph. Instead of a sharp crack, the hammer answered with a deep, hollow echo rising from somewhere beneath the floor. Margaret knelt beside the stone that had answered with a hollow echo and struck it again, this time more gently. The sound rolled beneath the floor before fading into silence. She stayed there for a long moment, listening as if the barn itself might offer an explanation. Instead, she heard only the wind moving through the aging walnut trees outside. Early the next morning, Ethan returned carrying a pry bar, a mason's hammer, and 2 heavy wooden wedges. Margaret spread the old photograph and the original farm plan across a workbench. The faded stairway in the photograph lined up almost perfectly with the hollow section beneath the floor. Ethan measured the distance twice from the nearest support post before marking the outline with chalk. "If there was an entrance," he said quietly, "this is where it should be." They began lifting the loose stones around the edge, one at a time. Most had settled firmly over the years, but 2 shifted after steady pressure from the pry bar. Dust poured from the narrow gaps as the first slab tilted upward. Beneath it lay packed dirt rather than solid rock. Margaret filled a bucket with loose soil while Ethan worked on the second stone. By midday, they had cleared enough space to expose a circular iron ring set flush into a much larger stone beneath the surface. Together, they pulled until the heavy slab slid aside several inches. Cold air drifted upward from below, carrying the smell of dry earth and old timber. Margaret held the lantern over the opening. Instead of stairs, she saw another flat surface several feet below. "It isn't empty," she whispered. "They widened the opening enough to climb down safely." The lower chamber proved smaller than the barn itself, built with carefully fitted limestone blocks that still looked remarkably solid. At the far end stood a rectangular stone doorway sealed by a thick slab carved to fit tightly into its frame. Unlike the rough masonry surrounding it, the door had been shaped with unusual precision. A shallow keyhole had been cut into the center. Margaret removed the smooth gray stone key from her apron pocket. She brushed away decades of dust before gently inserting it into the opening. The grooves matched perfectly. But when she tried to turn it, nothing moved. She pressed harder without forcing it. The key remained fixed, as though another mechanism still held the door closed. Ethan examined the edges. "It's locked from somewhere inside the frame," he said. "Or it's been sealed." Margaret withdrew the key carefully. Samuel didn't hide this by accident. They searched the chamber instead. Along one wall rested broken crates, empty glass jars, and several rusted farming tools. A narrow wooden shelf had collapsed onto the floor, scattering brittle papers beneath layers of dust. Most crumbled when touched, but one leather-bound notebook survived beneath a fallen board. Margaret carried it into the light. The cover had no title, only the initials S.W. pressed faintly into the leather. The first pages recorded ordinary harvest figures, rainfall, orchard yields, and purchases of seed and equipment. Samuel's handwriting was neat and practical. Several entries described repairing fences, replacing trees after storms, and hiring seasonal workers. Nothing hinted at the hidden chamber below the barn. Then, midway through the notebook, one sentence caught Margaret's attention. "Construction of the stone vault must remain known only to me until the work is complete." She looked toward the sealed doorway. "Stone vault," she read softly. Ethan repeated the words. So that's what he called it. Margaret continued reading. Samuel never explained exactly what would be placed inside. but he mentioned reinforcing the chamber with limestone and concealing the original stairway after construction ended. Several later pages had been torn cleanly from the binding. The missing sections left uneven edges where important entries had once been. "Someone removed these," Ethan said. Margaret nodded. "Not recently. The paper around the gaps had yellowed evenly with age. Whoever had taken them had done so many years before." They searched the remaining pages. Most described weather, crop failures, and repairs made to the aging orchard. One passage mentioned receiving repeated offers to sell the farm despite refusing every one. Another referred to promises that could not be broken, though Samuel gave no details. Late in the notebook, the handwriting grew heavier, as though written during exhaustion. Margaret turned one final page and found a single paragraph centered beneath the date. There were no harvest figures or orchard notes beneath it, only one carefully written sentence. She read it aloud. "If you're reading this, they never found the vault." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The sealed stone door stood silently at the end of the chamber, unchanged by the discovery. Whatever Samuel had hidden beyond it had remained untouched for decades. Margaret closed Samuel Whitmore's notebook with both hands, resting on its worn leather cover. The final sentence lingered in the quiet chamber beneath the barn. "If you're reading this, they never found the vault." She looked again at the sealed stone door standing only a few feet away. Whatever Samuel had protected remained exactly where he had intended. Ethan ran his fingers along the limestone frame, brushing away years of dust until narrow tool marks became visible. "This wasn't built by amateurs," he said. "Someone spent months shaping these stones." Margaret knelt beside the carved keyhole and inserted the smooth stone key once more. It slid into place as easily as before. This time she pressed gently inward before turning. A faint grinding sound echoed inside the wall. The key moved only a fraction before stopping. "Something changed," she whispered. Ethan listened with his ear against the stone. "There's another latch deeper inside." They searched the doorway carefully. Near the floor, Ethan discovered a narrow crack hidden beneath hardened mortar. Years of dust had concealed a small stone wedge, locking the lower edge of the slab in place. Working patiently with a chisel, they loosened the wedge until it slipped free. Margaret tried the key again. The grinding sound returned, followed by a heavy click from somewhere inside the frame. Together they pushed. At first, nothing happened. Then the stone slab shifted a single inch, scraping slowly across the floor. Cold, dry air drifted through the widening gap. They pushed again until the opening became wide enough to pass through. Margaret lifted the lantern and stepped inside first. The room beyond was larger than either of them expected. Thick limestone walls surrounded shelves built directly into the stone. Every surface carried a thin layer of dust that had settled undisturbed for decades. Wooden crates stood neatly stacked against one wall. Long tables filled the center of the chamber. Instead of treasure, the shelves held row after row of bound ledgers tied with cloth ribbons. Large rolled maps rested inside wooden racks. Metal document boxes lined another wall beside carefully labeled drawers. At the far end stood an old writing desk with an oil lamp still resting where someone had left it long ago. "He built an archive," Ethan said quietly. Margaret nodded without answering. She walked slowly between the shelves, reading handwritten labels. Orchard accounts, family loans, property agreements, harvest records, correspondence. Everything had been organized with remarkable care. She untied the ribbon around the first ledger. Inside were detailed, handwritten records listing names of neighboring farmers, loan amounts, repayment schedules, and handwritten notes marked "paid in full," even when no payments appeared beneath them. Margaret opened another book. The same pattern repeated. Families borrowed money during failed harvests. Samuel recorded every debt, yet many ended with a short sentence written in the margin, "Obligation forgiven." Ethan looked over her shoulder. He wasn't collecting debts. Margaret turned another page. He was releasing them. Nearby, she found large, folded maps showing nearly every farm surrounding the Walnut farm. Colored marks connected properties by roads, irrigation ditches, and shared orchard equipment. Small handwritten notes identified widows, injured veterans, young families, and aging couples struggling to keep their land. Samuel had recorded not only acreage, but lives. Against the opposite wall rested several wooden boxes filled with letters bundled by year. Margaret opened one carefully. Nearly every envelope had been addressed to Samuel Whitmore. Many began with words of gratitude. "Thank you for giving us another season. We would have lost everything without your kindness. Our children still have a home because of you." She read silently until her eyes blurred. None of the letters appeared to have been answered. Ethan continued examining the shelves. "Something's missing." Margaret looked up. Several spaces between the document boxes stood empty. Dust outlined where other boxes had once rested. "There should be more records here." The empty spaces matched the missing pages in Samuel's notebook. Someone had removed part of the archive long before the vault had been sealed. Margaret felt disappointment rise briefly before reminding herself how much remained. Even incomplete, the collection filled nearly every shelf. At the writing desk, she found another large map spread beneath a sheet of glass. Dozens of nearby farms had been marked with careful circles in blue ink. Beside them, Samuel had written short notes identifying each family by name. One sentence stretched across the bottom of the map in firm handwriting. "Never let these families lose their land." Margaret stood silently before the map. Suddenly, the abandoned orchard outside seemed different. The neglected trees, collapsing barn, and forgotten farmhouse no longer looked like the remains of a failed business. They looked like the last shelter protecting a promise someone had refused to abandon. Ethan rested one hand against the edge of the desk. No wonder he never sold. Margaret nodded slowly. This farm was never just his. She rolled the map carefully and held it beneath the lantern light. The names, circles, and handwritten notes covered nearly every neighboring property for miles around. Whatever story Samuel had left behind was far larger than the Walnut farm alone. Margaret spent the next morning copying the names from Samuel Whitmore's map into a notebook. Some were written beside farms that still existed. Others belonged to properties divided by roads, sold to developers, or absorbed into larger holdings. Ethan recognized several family names, though he knew little about their connection to Samuel. "Most people around here only remember that the Whitmore farm failed," he said. "They say Samuel borrowed too much, refused to modernize, and lost everything." Margaret looked toward the dark entrance of the stone vault. Then someone remembered the ending and forgot the reason. Their first visit was to the Mercer farm 3 miles west, where a young couple now raised goats on land marked with a blue circle on Samuel's map. Laura Mercer listened politely while her husband examined the copied page. Neither had heard that Samuel Whitmore once held records connected to their property. "My grandfather said the family nearly lost the farm during the Depression," Laura explained. "But he never mentioned Samuel. He always said the bank changed its mind." Margaret showed them a ledger entry bearing the Mercer name. A loan had been recorded, then marked "Obligation forgiven" in Samuel's handwriting. Laura touched the page with one finger. "Why would he do that?" "I'm trying to find out," Margaret said. "At the Dalton property, now reduced to a farmhouse and 12 acres. The owner knew only that Samuel had died poor and stubborn at the Briggs orchard. Eleanor's nephew remembered hearing that the Whitmore trees once produced the finest walnuts in the county, but nothing about the families named in the vault. Each visit produced the same pattern: hardship, remembered; rescue, unexplained. Samuel's role, missing. By afternoon, Margaret began to wonder whether the map represented promises he had intended to keep rather than help he had actually given. Ethan noticed her disappointment as they drove along a narrow farm road. "Records don't always travel with families," he said. "People lose papers. Children avoid talking about bad years. Sometimes gratitude turns into shame." Marge thought of her own sons, and how quickly a life of care could be reduced to 2 suitcases by the door. And sometimes people remember only what protects their pride. Their final name belonged to the Coyle family. Eleanor directed them to a small white house near the old rail crossing, where 91-year-old Thomas Coyle lived with his granddaughter. Thomas had poor hearing, but a clear memory. When Margaret mentioned Samuel Whitmore, he gripped the arms of his chair and asked her to repeat the name. "You found Samuel's papers?" he said. Margaret placed a copy of the map on the table. Thomas studied the blue circles, then pointed to a parcel near the southern edge. "That was ours. 40 acres then. My father planted beans because the walnut crop failed 3 years straight." "Did Samuel help your family?" Margaret asked. Thomas looked toward the window as if the past stood outside. "The bank was going to take the place. My father had signed everything they put in front of him. We were packing dishes when Samuel arrived." He paused to steady his breathing. He brought a receipt showing the overdue amount had been paid. "Told my father the land was his again." Ethan leaned forward. "Did Samuel lend him the money?" "That's what father thought. He tried to repay it every harvest. Samuel refused every time." Thomas smiled faintly. "Said one farmer surviving helped every farm around him survive." Margaret opened Samuel's ledger to the Coyle entry. The amount matched Thomas's memory. Beneath it, Samuel had written, "Deed released, family remains." "Why did no one talk about this?" she asked. Thomas's smile disappeared. "Because Samuel made them promise not to. He said men who had nearly lost their land deserved to keep their dignity. Later, when his own farm failed, people assumed he had wasted his money. Some of the families he helped were already gone. Others were too ashamed to speak." He looked at Margaret. "He saved us, and we let the town call him a fool." Before they left, Thomas asked his granddaughter to bring a wooden box from the bedroom. Inside were old tax receipts and one yellowed note from Samuel. It contained no request for repayment, only a reminder that the next season's seed should be purchased before winter prices rose. Thomas offered the note to Margaret. "It belongs with the others, back at Walnut Farm." Margaret carried it into the vault and placed it beside the Coyle ledger. The room no longer felt like an archive of forgotten debts. It felt like a record of people who had remained in their homes because one man had chosen to lose quietly. She and Ethan returned to the correspondence shelves. Most boxes contained letters sent to Samuel, but behind the lowest row, Margaret found a narrow compartment hidden by a warped panel. Inside were dozens of envelopes in Samuel's handwriting. Every one had an address. None had a stamp. They were letters he had written but never mailed. Margaret opened the first. It was addressed to a bank manager and requested an extension for a neighboring farmer after a failed harvest. Another offered Samuel's equipment as security for a widow's overdue mortgage. A third asked that collection notices be sent to him rather than to a family with young children. The letters became increasingly urgent. Samuel promised walnut income that had not yet arrived, pledged future crops, and accepted responsibility for debts that were not his. Some drafts were calm and formal. Others carried crossed-out sentences revealing exhaustion and anger. He kept taking the burden onto himself. Margaret said, Ethan opened a letter addressed to the county agricultural lender, and he kept the families from knowing how much it cost. Near the bottom of the compartment, they found a thick file labeled Whitmore Defaults. The first pages listed missed payments against the Walnut farm. Attached documents showed Samuel had used the farmhouse, orchard equipment, and future harvest contracts as collateral. Margaret followed the dates through several seasons. Each new debt corresponded with a released mortgage or forgiven loan recorded for another family. The final document was a notice of foreclosure issued against Samuel himself. Beneath it rested a signed order from the lender demanding that he recover the outstanding debts from the farmers whose properties he had protected. Samuel's handwritten response appeared on the last page. "I will not remove families from land they have worked all their lives, merely to preserve my own title." The lender's reply was stamped beneath it. "Refusal accepted as default. Whitmore Farm subject to seizure." Margaret stared at the words until they blurred. Samuel had not lost the farm because he could not collect what others owed. He had lost it because he refused to take their land. Margaret spent the next morning arranging Samuel's ledgers, maps, and unsent letters across the farmhouse table. The file marked Whitmore Default lay open beside the old farm map, its final page still visible. Refusal accepted as default. Whitmore Farm subject to seizure. Ethan arrived before sunrise, carrying coffee in 2 metal cups, and found her tracing the blue-circled properties with one finger. "You haven't slept," he said. "Not much." She pointed to several names near the southern edge of the map. Thomas Coyle remembered exactly what happened. But memories won't be enough. Samuel recorded addresses, parcel numbers, and old boundary markers. If those still match county records, we can prove these weren't stories he invented after losing the farm. Ethan studied the map. Some of those roads changed names. A few farms were divided. Then we start with the ones still standing. Their first stop was the former Mercer parcel, where Laura Mercer led them to a fence line behind the goat pasture. Samuel's ledger described a stone marker beside a double-trunk hickory. The hickory was gone, but after clearing weeds, Ethan found a square limestone post sunk almost completely beneath the soil. The parcel number carved into its side matched Samuel's notebook. Laura stared at it. "I've walked past this for years." Margaret photographed the marker beside the copied ledger entry, "At the old Dalton property." The original boundary ran along a dry irrigation ditch now filled with brush. The owner believed the western field had always belonged to a neighboring farm, but Samuel's map placed the line 40 feet farther out. They found 2 rusted pins where the older survey indicated. One bore the same initials recorded in Samuel's papers. The discovery did not change current ownership. Yet it confirmed that his maps had been based on real surveys rather than recollection. By midday, they had checked 4 addresses. 3 still carried physical markers matching Samuel's records. The 4th had been paved beneath a county road. But Eleanor located an old tax booklet at her seed store, showing the same parcel boundaries and family name. "He kept better records than the courthouse," she said. Maybe because he knew the courthouse might forget. Over the next 2 days, Margaret and Ethan followed addresses from Samuel's ledgers across the valley. They found iron posts buried beneath blackberry vines, engraved stones beside collapsed barns, and fence corners that aligned with the measurements in the stone vault. Several descendants brought out boxes of inherited papers, old tax receipts, handwritten loan statements, and released mortgage notices repeated the dates Samuel had recorded. Each match strengthened the pattern. A family faced foreclosure. Samuel intervened, the debt disappeared, and his own obligations increased. Margaret copied everything carefully, labeling each photograph and note before returning the originals. The work exhausted her, but it also steadied her. For years, she had measured her value by what her family needed from her. Now she was doing something no one had asked her to do, and it mattered. Ethan noticed the change. "On the drive back from a distant property," he said. "You don't look like someone who plans to sell anymore." Margaret watched rows of late-season fields pass the window. "I don't know what I plan. I only know Samuel deserves more than a few rumors." That's usually how plans begin. When they returned to Walnut Farm, a white envelope had been fastened to the farmhouse door. It carried the seal of the county land office. Inside was a formal notice stating that Victor Kane had filed a petition questioning the validity of Margaret's ownership because the county auction description may have omitted unresolved agricultural liens and access claims until review. She was warned not to alter certain structures or remove historical records from the property. Margaret read the notice twice. "He can't claim the farm after the county sold it to me." Ethan took the pages. "He may not need to win. He can delay repairs, challenge access, and make you spend money you don't have." "I have no money at all." "Exactly." Victor arrived that afternoon in the same polished pickup. Margaret met him on the porch with the legal notice in her hand. "You filed this." "I requested clarification," he said. "The county auction was poorly handled. There may be obligations attached to the property. You offered to buy it knowing that I offered to relieve you of the risk." His gaze moved toward the storage barn. "You've been asking questions all over town. Old debts make people nervous." Margaret folded the notice. "You said the land was worthless." "Most of it is." "Then why are you trying so hard to control what happens here?" Victor's expression remained calm, but his jaw tightened. "Because neglected properties affect neighboring operations." "Take my offer before the county freezes everything." "No." The answer came more easily than she expected. Victor looked at Ethan, then back at Margaret. "Stubbornness ruined Samuel Whitmore." "No," Margaret said. "Refusing to throw families off their land ruined him." For the first time, Victor's composure slipped. He recovered quickly, but not before she saw recognition in his eyes. "Stories grow prettier with age," he said. "Paperwork is less sentimental. Then paperwork is exactly what I'll use." He left without another word. The legal notice prevented them from removing anything from the stone vault, but it did not stop Margaret from documenting the farm itself. Samuel's oldest notebook contained a short reference to duplicate records stored where horses once stood over dry ground. The Walnut Farm's horse barn had partially collapsed decades earlier, leaving only one stone wall and a roofless stall section near the north orchard. Margaret and Ethan searched the remaining floor that evening. Most of it was packed earth, hardened by time. One stall, however, had been paved with flat bricks unlike the rest. Samuel's note mentioned the third stall from the east wall. They counted twice, beneath a layer of rotted straw and dust. The bricks formed a rectangle with a narrow iron loop at one corner. Ethan cleared the edges with a shovel. This was meant to lift. The slab resisted until they worked a pry bar beneath it. Together they raised it enough to reveal a shallow cavity lined with cedar boards. Inside lay a rectangular metal box wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric remained dry despite the damp ground above. Margaret knelt and brushed dirt from the lid. A strip of wax sealed the edges, and Samuel's initials had been pressed into it. Ethan looked at her. Duplicate records. Margaret rested both hands on the box. Whatever had been removed from the stone vault might still be here, hidden beneath the floor of the old horse barn. Margaret carried the oilcloth-wrapped box into the farmhouse, while Ethan replaced the brick slab over the cavity beneath the old horse stall. Rain had begun tapping against the remaining roof timbers, and neither of them wanted to open Samuel's records in the damp barn. On the kitchen table, Margaret carefully cut through the wax seal stamped with his initials. The metal lid lifted with a faint groan. Inside lay 3 leather journals, a packet of folded documents, and several envelopes tied together with black ribbon. Unlike the papers in the stone vault, These had been protected from dust and moisture. Samuel's handwriting remained dark and clear across the first journal. The early entries covered the years after the Walnut farm began taking responsibility for neighboring debts. He recorded each family's circumstances without judgment. Failed crops, illness, machinery accidents, widows left with children, and farms caught between falling prices and rising interest. Beside every name, he listed what he had pledged to keep that family on its land. Sometimes it was a walnut harvest, sometimes equipment, sometimes a section of his own orchard. He was giving pieces of the farm away before anyone knew it. Margaret said, Ethan read over her shoulder, not giving them away, putting them between the families and the bank. The second journal began after Samuel's finances had already started collapsing. His entries became shorter, though never careless. He described creditors arriving at the farmhouse, equipment being removed, and workers leaving when wages could no longer be guaranteed. He knew people in town believed he had mismanaged the orchard. Some former friends stopped speaking to him. Others advised him to collect every debt and save what remained. Samuel refused. In one entry, he wrote, I could recover the Whitmore title by taking the Coyle land, the Mercer place, and 2 smaller farms before winter. The arithmetic is simple. The cost is not. Margaret paused over those words. She remembered Daniel and Paul placing a train schedule before her, as though removing her from their lives had been an ordinary household decision. Samuel had possessed legal documents that could have forced families from their homes, yet he had chosen to lose his own instead. He could have saved himself, she said. Ethan shook his head. Not in a way he could live with. The third journal had been written during Samuel's final years at the farm. The cover was cracked, and several pages had been repaired with narrow cloth strips. By then, most of the productive walnut acreage had been mortgaged or neglected. Samuel described sleeping in one room to save fuel and selling personal belongings for taxes. He knew the town called him proud, foolish, and secretive. He also understood that the families he had helped might never speak publicly. Their silence disappointed him, but he did not resent them. Shame, he wrote, is another kind of debt, and I did not save their land so their children would inherit humiliation. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. All her life she had believed love meant giving until others no longer needed to notice the cost. When her sons finally dismissed her, she had taken their decision as proof that years of care had left no value behind. Samuel's journals offered another possibility. A sacrifice could remain meaningful even when no one praised it. Being forgotten did not make the choice worthless. She turned to the final pages. Samuel wrote that the truth might survive in fragments, the stone vault, the buried duplicate records, the letters families had sent, and the old property markers scattered across the valley. He no longer expected the county to restore his name. He hoped only that someone patient enough to follow those fragments would understand what the Walnut farm had protected. The last complete entry read, I may leave this land known as a failure. Let that be the price. A title can be recovered by paper. A family cannot recover the years lost after being driven from its home. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she closed the book. Ethan poured water into the kettle and gave her time to sit in silence. When my sons told me to leave, she said at last, I thought it meant I had wasted my life on people who could forget me so easily. Ethan set 2 cups on the table. Do you still think that I confused being needed with having worth? She looked toward the dark orchard beyond the window. Samuel lost everything people could count. But the family stayed. Their children grew up on their own land. Maybe the part that mattered was never visible from his porch. Ethan sat across from her. And maybe your life isn't finished being counted. Margaret almost laughed, but emotion tightened her throat. She rested one hand on the journal. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go." Samuel spent years making sure other people never reached that point. The documents beneath the journals included copied mortgage releases, private loan agreements, and notes confirming the transfer of Samuel's collateral to cover neighboring debts. Several matched the empty spaces in the stone vault. Others appeared to be originals removed before the chamber was sealed. At the bottom of the box, Margaret found a bundle of correspondence tied with black ribbon. Most letters were addressed to Samuel by lenders, county officials, or families he had helped. One envelope was marked private and bore the name Charles Danner. Ethan recognized it immediately. "Danner managed the Whitmore farm before it failed," he said. "My father used to mention him." Samuel trusted him with the books. Equipment, everything. Margaret opened the envelope. The letter inside had been written in a hurried, uneven hand. Charles admitted that he had copied Samuel's private ledgers and delivered them to the lender in exchange for protection from his own debts. He had also revealed which farms Samuel intended to shield and where several original agreements were stored. His information allowed creditors to isolate Samuel's assets and force him into default while leaving the neighboring families exposed. Charles claimed he had believed Samuel would eventually surrender and begin foreclosures. When Samuel refused, Charles remained silent and allowed the town to blame him for the farm's collapse. The final lines were an apology written years too late. Margaret read the signature twice before lowering the page. Samuel had not been ruined only by drought, debt, or kindness. The man closest to him, the manager trusted with every account on the Walnut farm, had betrayed him. Ethan spent the next morning calling the county records office while Margaret organized Samuel's journals, mortgage releases, property maps, and Charles Danner's confession into separate folders. The legal notice Victor had filed still hung on a nail beside the farmhouse door, warning her not to remove historical records from the property. She had no intention of removing anything permanently, but copies would be necessary if she wanted the truth examined beyond the Walnut farm. By noon, Ethan had reached a senior clerk willing to search the old agricultural archives. "The records were moved twice," he explained after ending the call. "Some are in the courthouse basement. Others went to a storage annex when the rural bank closed." "Will they let us see them?" Margaret asked. "Tomorrow, if we bring parcel numbers and proof that you own the farm." They arrived at the courthouse shortly after opening. The archive room occupied the lower floor, where concrete walls held the chill even in warm weather. A clerk named Miriam Shaw led them past shelves of tax books, deed indexes, and boxed loan files. She listened without interrupting as Margaret explained the stone vault and Samuel's records. When Margaret showed her the parcel numbers, Miriam's expression changed from polite doubt to concentration. "These are old," she said, "but they're organized well enough to trace." For several hours, they worked through county ledgers and retired bank summaries. The first confirmation came from the Mercer property. A county entry showed a scheduled foreclosure canceled after an unidentified third party paid the overdue amount. The date matched Samuel's ledger exactly. The Coyle farm revealed the same pattern. A mortgage release had been recorded 3 days after Samuel pledged part of his walnut harvest as collateral. Other properties followed Dalton, Briggs, Mercer, and names Margaret had copied from the blue-circled map. Each official transaction reflected the same hidden structure Samuel had documented. Families kept their land. Samuel assumed the cost. He separated his name from the payments. Miriam said, comparing two files, "That's why later generations never knew who intervened." Margaret looked at the faded signatures. He wanted them to believe they had recovered on their own. The archive records also supported Samuel's private notes about the Walnut farm's collapse. New liens appeared against his orchard after each neighboring foreclosure was stopped. Equipment loans were extended against future crops. Several withdrawals from Samuel's personal accounts aligned with mortgage releases for families on the map. Yet the final banking files remained missing from the courthouse collection. Miriam searched an index and found a reference to a closed institution whose records had been transferred to the annex outside town. She wrote an authorization note and warned them the boxes might not be cataloged at the storage annex. They found rows of metal shelving beneath humming fluorescent lights, dust-coated cartons marked with bank names that no longer existed. Ethan located the correct year, while Margaret searched by account number. Near closing time, she opened a box labeled Special Agricultural Accounts and found correspondence bearing Samuel Whitmore's name. The documents showed that Samuel had negotiated privately with the lender to prevent mass foreclosure across the valley. He had agreed to consolidate overdue farm debts under his own account, using the Walnut farm as security. In return, the lender released claims against the families. The agreement had never appeared in local newspapers or public notices. Margaret pressed one hand to the table. He made himself the only person they could pursue. Ethan nodded. And when he refused to collect from the families, the bank took everything from him. Miriam arranged for certified copies, but warned that public recognition would require formal review by county officials. Margaret understood. The records were powerful, yet proof had spent decades being ignored before. When they returned to the farm, 3 vehicles waited near the porch. Eleanor stood beside the seed store truck with Thomas Coyle's granddaughter and 2 members of the Mercer family. Word had spread that official records supported Samuel's ledgers. Thomas had sent a signed statement describing the day Samuel arrived with the receipt that saved the Coyle land. Laura Mercer brought her grandfather's tax papers. Others arrived before sunset carrying inherited letters, released mortgage notices, and old family photographs. The stories were no longer isolated memories. They were becoming a shared history. Victor Kane arrived while Margaret was laying copies across the kitchen table. He entered without removing his hat and looked at the growing stack of documents. "You've stirred up half the county," he said. "They came because their families are named here." "Old papers don't increase the farm's agricultural value." Margaret met his gaze. "You no longer sound as though the land is worthless." Victor ignored the remark. He questioned the authenticity of Samuel's journals and suggested that private notes could have been written to excuse business failure. Ethan placed the certified county copies beside them. "These aren't private notes." Victor glanced through the records but refused to examine them closely. Payments made by Whitmore don't prove noble intentions. He may have expected control of those properties later. Thomas Coyle's granddaughter stepped forward. "Then why were the deeds released without his name attached?" Laura Mercer added. "Why did every family remain on its land while he lost his?" More voices followed from the doorway. People who had once known only that Samuel went bankrupt now repeated dates, amounts, and family stories preserved in their own homes. Victor tried to dismiss them as sentimental memories, but the room no longer belonged to him. Margaret watched the shift happen quietly. For years, Samuel's silence had allowed others to define his failure. Now the descendants of those he protected were speaking for him. Victor placed the legal notice on the table. "The ownership review is still active." "Then let the county review everything," Margaret replied. "The farm, the vault, the ledgers, and your petition." He stared at her for several seconds before leaving. No one followed him outside. That evening, Ethan and Margaret returned to the courthouse annex with Miriam's authorization to inspect one final sealed account file referenced in the banking index. The folder contained withdrawal slips, collateral transfers, and a summary prepared when the lender seized the Walnut farm. Margaret read each page slowly. Samuel had exhausted the farm accounts first. Then he liquidated his equipment reserve, his personal savings, and an inheritance held separately from the orchard. The final bank memorandum confirmed that every remaining dollar of Samuel Whitmore's private estate had been applied to release agricultural debts belonging to other families. Only after his personal assets reached zero did the lender foreclose on the Walnut farm. Margaret held the certified copy beneath the archive light. There was no longer room for rumor or interpretation. Samuel had used everything he owned to buy back other people's land. Margaret carried the certified bank memorandum into the county hearing room with Samuel's journals. The blue-circled map, the mortgage releases, Charles Danner's confession, and copies of every family record gathered over the previous weeks. Ethan walked beside her with 2 archive boxes. Eleanor followed with Thomas Coyle's signed statement and a folder of letters contributed by descendants across the valley. The room filled before the hearing began. Families whose names had once existed only in Samuel's ledgers now sat together beneath the fluorescent lights, holding photographs, deeds, tax receipts, and stories that had survived without explanation for generations. Victor Kane arrived with an attorney and took a seat near the front. He avoided looking toward Margaret. The county review panel consisted of 3 officials, a historical preservation officer, and a retired agricultural banking examiner brought in to assess the older financial documents. Margaret was asked first to explain how the stone vault had been discovered. She described the missing underground space on the original farm plan, the hollow floor beneath the storage barn, the carved stone key, and the sealed archive Samuel had protected for decades. She did not embellish. The records were strong enough without drama. Ethan presented photographs of the surviving property markers and explained how Samuel's maps matched physical boundaries still visible across the valley. Miriam Shaw confirmed that the certified mortgage releases and bank files had come from official county and institutional archives. One by one, the descendants spoke. Laura Mercer described the foreclosure entry canceled by an unnamed third-party payment. Thomas Coyle's granddaughter read his statement about Samuel arriving with the receipt that kept their family on its land. Eleanor submitted letters thanking Samuel for another planting season, a repaired well, and time granted after failed harvests. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Families had been saved. Their debts had been transferred. Samuel's estate had carried the cost. Victor's attorney argued that generosity did not establish historical importance and that the Walnut farm remained economically unproductive. The banking examiner looked over his glasses. Economic productivity is not the question before us. Documentary significance is. He held up the certified memorandum. This record confirms that Samuel Whitmore exhausted his personal and agricultural assets to release secured claims against multiple neighboring farms. That is not a matter of interpretation. Victor shifted in his chair. His attorney then questioned whether the stone vault documents had been altered. Miriam responded that dates, signatures, parcel numbers, and transaction amounts matched independent county records. Charles Danner's confession aligned with the disappearance of selected files and with the lender's access to Samuel's private accounts. The preservation officer asked Margaret why Samuel had hidden the material instead of defending himself publicly. Margaret looked toward the families seated behind her. Because many of them would have been humiliated if their debts became public. He protected their dignity even after they stopped speaking for him. The room remained quiet. He knew people might remember him as a failed farmer, she continued. He accepted that rather than force families from land they had worked all their lives. The panel recessed for nearly an hour. Margaret waited in the hallway beside Ethan, twisting the edge of her sleeve. Whatever they decide, he said, the truth is already out. She looked through the glass doors at the people sharing documents and family memories. I know, but I want the farm protected from being buried again. When the panel returned, the chairwoman read the findings slowly. The county rejected Victor's challenge to Margaret's title. ruling that the reclamation auction had transferred the property lawfully and that no unresolved lien justified reopening the sale. The petition restricting repairs and access was withdrawn. The stone vault, storage barn, farmhouse records, and surviving orchard were granted provisional historical protection, effective immediately. While permanent designation was completed, most importantly, the Walnut Farm was formally recognized as a local site of agricultural and community significance because of Samuel Whitmore's documented role in preventing widespread farm loss. Applause began softly at the back of the room, then spread. Margaret did not raise her hands or smile at first. She closed her eyes and imagined Samuel sitting alone in the farmhouse while townspeople called him stubborn and foolish. At last, his failure had been named correctly. It was sacrifice outside. Victor caught up with Margaret near the courthouse steps. His attorney had already left. "You've made the place impossible to develop," he said. "That was always the point, wasn't it?" she asked. He looked toward the crowd gathering around Ethan and Eleanor. "My offer is withdrawn." "I assumed it would be. You'll spend years repairing that farm. Historical recognition doesn't fix roofs or revive dead trees." Margaret folded the hearing notice and placed it inside her bag. "Neither does selling to someone who thinks value begins with profit." Victor gave her a long, unreadable look, then walked away. The following weeks brought inspectors, volunteers, and more work than Margaret had believed possible. The county installed temporary supports beneath the storage barn and approved stabilization of the stone vault. Families donated lumber, labor, tools, and small amounts of money. Ethan repaired the east beam in the farmhouse. Eleanor organized weekend meals for the volunteers. Laura Mercer began cataloging family names from Samuel's ledgers. Children cleared fallen branches from the orchard while older residents identified trees planted before the farm's decline. Margaret remained involved in every decision. She learned to read preservation reports, label archive boxes, and plan repairs in stages. Each night she returned exhausted to the same house that had once felt like proof of her desperation. Now the worn kitchen table held schedules, donations, and letters from people asking how they could help. One evening, Ethan found her holding Victor's original purchase offer. "Keeping a souvenir?" he asked. Margaret looked at the figure that had once seemed like rescue. "I was wondering how close I came to selling, to believing escape was the same as starting over." She tore the offer down the middle and fed both halves into the iron stove. "I'm keeping the farm." Ethan nodded as though he had known before she did. "Then we'd better save the orchard." Margaret smiled. "One tree at a time." After the volunteers left that weekend, she returned alone to the stone vault to continue cataloging the final shelves. Most ledgers had been matched with county records. The unsent letters were stored in protective sleeves. Samuel's journals rested in a dry cabinet beside the blue-circled map. At the rear of the vault, beneath the old writing desk, Margaret noticed a narrow wooden chest she had assumed was part of the furniture. Dust sealed its edges, and a dark metal band wrapped around the lid. Unlike the other boxes, it carried no family name, account number, or year. Only a small brass plate had been fixed to the front. The words were faint but still legible. "For the next keeper of Walnut Farm." Margaret knelt before it. A wax seal covered the lock, unbroken since Samuel's time. She touched it once, then reached for the stone key. Margaret pressed the stone key into the wax seal, breaking the brittle surface without damaging the brass lock beneath it. The key fit, though not in the way it had fitted the door to the stone vault. This time she had to turn it twice. The chest opened with a faint sigh of trapped air. Inside lay a folded wool cloth, a narrow ledger, and one sealed envelope addressed in Samuel Whitmore's handwriting, To the next keeper of Walnut Farm. Margaret lifted the envelope carefully and sat on the stone floor beside the old writing desk. Ethan remained near the doorway, close enough to help, but far enough to let the moment belong to her. She broke the seal. Samuel's letter began without ceremony. If you are reading this, then the farm has survived me, and perhaps it has also survived the story people chose to tell about it. Margaret paused, feeling the words settle around her. Samuel wrote that he had never believed land belonged only to the person named on a deed. The Walnut Farm had given work during hard years, seed during failed seasons, and shelter to families waiting for another chance. Selling it to preserve his own comfort would have betrayed everything the farm had become. He knew the orchard might die and the buildings might fall. He knew the town might remember him as a poor manager. Still, he had refused every offer because a buyer would have gained not only trees and soil, but the hidden records of families whose dignity he had promised to protect. The farm, he wrote, must remain until the truth could be told without harming those it was meant to save. Margaret read the next passage twice. I do not know who you are, or what loss brought you here. People rarely choose broken places while their own lives are whole. But if you found the vault, then perhaps you understand that ruin and worth are not the same thing. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Ethan lowered his eyes. Samuel continued by asking the future keeper to make the records public only when the families could stand beside them without shame. He asked that the orchard be replanted, not as a monument to him, but as proof that generosity could outlive the person who paid for it. The final line was written more heavily than the rest. Keep the land open to those who need to remember that survival is sometimes a shared harvest. Margaret folded the letter along its original creases. For months she had wondered why Samuel never sold, even after the bank took his equipment, his savings, and nearly every productive acre. Now the answer was complete. He had not been clinging to a failed farm. He had been guarding the last safe place where the truth could wait. The narrow ledger beneath the letter contained no debts. It listed names of families Samuel hoped would someday return to the farm, not to repay him, but to teach what they knew: pruning, grafting, soil care, irrigation, seed saving, bookkeeping, and mutual aid. Besides several names were brief notes about children who might carry those skills forward. Margaret recognized surnames from the hearing room. The plan had been unfinished, but its purpose was clear. Samuel had imagined the Walnut Farm becoming useful again long before anyone believed it could be saved. Restoration took more than goodwill. The east wall of the storage barn required reinforcement before winter. The farmhouse needed new wiring. Several old walnut trees were too diseased to preserve, and removing them felt like losing witnesses. Ethan helped Margaret mark which trunks could be treated and which had to come down. He never made decisions for her. He explained what he saw, listened when she disagreed, and returned the next morning with tools. Eleanor organized volunteers through the seed store. Laura Mercer created a catalog of the families named in Samuel's ledgers. Thomas Coyle's granddaughter recorded his memories before age could take more of them. County preservation grants covered the vault's climate controls, while local donations paid for roof repairs and new windows. The work moved slowly because Margaret refused to make the farm look new. She wanted every repaired beam and cleaned stone to show what had survived. In early spring, the community gathered to plant the first row of young walnut trees. Ethan placed the saplings along the old orchard line while children carried buckets of water. Margaret knelt in the soil beside a tree planted near Samuel's original farmhouse path. Her hands ached, but the pain felt honest and useful. This one should bear in 6 or 7 years, Ethan said. Margaret looked down the row. Then we'll have to be patient. You seem to be getting good at that, she smiled. The Walnut Farm reopened that summer as a small educational center for agricultural history and community cooperation. The farmhouse kitchen became a meeting room. The storage barn displayed copies of Samuel's maps, loan records, and family letters. Visitors could see the stone stairway and enter the vault in small, supervised groups. Margaret insisted that the exhibit not present Samuel as a saint. It showed his mistakes, his secrecy, and the consequences of trying to carry every burden alone. But it also showed what his choices preserved: land, homes, family lines, and a community that had finally remembered its debt. Ethan managed the orchard restoration beside her. Their companionship grew through ordinary work rather than Promise's morning inspections. Shared meals, arguments over pruning schedules, and quiet evenings on the porch. He never asked Margaret to become someone different from the woman who had arrived with 2 suitcases. He simply treated her as though she had always belonged in every decision. One afternoon, Daniel and Paul appeared at the end of the farm road. Margaret saw them from the porch but did not hurry to meet them. They had read about the historical designation and wanted to explain. Their apologies were uncertain, mixed with embarrassment and surprise at what she had built. Margaret listened without interrupting. She did not invite them to decide her future again, and she did not use Samuel's story to punish them. She told them they could return when they were ready to know her as a person rather than a problem. Then she went back to work. By the first autumn harvest, only a few older trees produced nuts, but the community gathered anyway. Children filled small baskets. Eleanor served bread beneath the porch awning. Ethan hung photographs showing the orchard before restoration and after the first new planting. Margaret watched families cross the yard carrying names she had first seen circled on Samuel's map. She understood then that being thrown out had not emptied her life. It had forced her away from a place where her worth had been measured by convenience and led her to one where care left visible roots. At sunset, she descended into the stone vault alone. Samuel's letter rested in a protected case beside the final ledger. Margaret checked the shelves, switched off the lamp, and closed the stone door. Outside the entrance, Ethan had mounted a walnut board carved with the words she had chosen from everything Samuel taught her. Margaret touched the lettering before locking the vault. Some harvests take generations.